And thank you, everyone. Good morning. All right, so here we are, again, talking about SDN and NFV. And I think, to understand the state of SDN and NFV is something that we'll not be able to do in 20 minutes. That's unlikely. But the good news is that it's not 20 minutes, but we have at least 3 days here to talk about SDN and the state of NFV in 2019. In order to understand where we are today, I think it's usually instructive to look backwards, right? And to see how we got here and the journey we took to get here. So let's see if this works. Excellent. All right, so I'm going to start with a series of dates. And maybe some of you recognize them, maybe not. But we'll start with 17th and 19th of October 2011, Stanford University in California, USA. 24th of October 2012 in Darmstadt, Germany. And some of you were in both places. And then obviously 14th to 17th of October 2019 at the Hague in Netherlands right now. So what do all those dates have in common? Well, they represent milestones in the journey in SDN and NFV. The first one, Stanford University, was the first open networking summit on 17th October 2011, and the Stanford Clean Slate project, along with the newly minted Open Networking Foundation, I guess the original Open Networking Foundation, generated a lot of conversations around OpenFlow, right? And that's when we thought networking was really hot again. It was hot before, I guess, right? All of us are networking, but it got really hot. It was really exciting. And then 1 year later, at the very first SDN and NFV Congress, the same show they were all at, 13 carriers, a very lucky number, pushed the concept of NFV in that white paper, which I think everyone here has probably downloaded a copy of. Keep it on your shelf. Well, actually, you probably didn't print it, did you? But that was the first time we saw NFV. And then now, 8 or 7 years later, whatever you want to count, starting with OpenFlow or starting with NFV, the question is, where are we with SDN and NFV? So in order to understand SDN and NFV, we have to look at the business needs across both the service providers and the enterprises. And what are we seeing? So in service providers, we have things like OTTs, right? Over the tops. Everyone knows about them. We use those to drive business cases within carriers. You just have to say the word OTT and maybe a project gets funded automatically because it's supposed to dispel the threat of OTT, right? But fundamentally, they have a lot to deal with if you're a carrier. Maybe you're looking at content. Maybe you're gobbling up content companies. Maybe that strategy didn't quite work out. That, along with the fact that maybe some of them bought cloud companies and had issues with that as well. But now there's a new wave, right? With 5G and Edge, we have a chance to do it again. Maybe, maybe not, who knows? But fundamentally, what we're finding is that carriers are in transition, culturally, organizationally, business-wise, and most of them are cloud-aware, but they're not necessarily cloud-savvy, which may or may not be a problem. On the enterprise side, enterprises are now globally competitive. A lot of them are now core-focused, understanding the need to outsource non-critical functions, right? And they're moving to the agile methodology, trying to get products out much faster. And everyone really wants to be cloud-like, right? Now, given those competitive pressures, given what everyone is facing, whether you're a service provider or a carrier, the question here is, do we still need SDN and NFV? And I think the reality is that SDN and NFV are still sorely needed. The little chart from McKinsey that looked at the growth of companies, service providers particularly, versus the rest of the market. The black bar up there shows since 2007, before the Great Recession, so to speak, where they are. So the last 11 years, that's the growth of the market in the black bar from a revenue perspective. And then the bottom one shows the growth in revenue of service providers. The right side, the same black and the same light blue or cyan, shows that for the EBITDA, the change in EBITDA. And so if you look at that, you say, well, that recession left the operators in a weaker state, and so they need a better infrastructure, culturally, organizationally, technology-wise, to weather the next downturn that may be coming. When it's coming, who knows? But SDN and NFV represent ways and techniques to improve the overall operational capacity of a service provider. And so fundamentally, if you look at the SDN and NFV journey, how we got here, I think that will tell us what it is going forward. But I think fundamentally that it is still needed. Some people will declare SDN and NFV as dead. They'll say, SDN, NFV, is no longer hot, right? Well, I think the reality is we all know that everything goes through hype cycles. And where are we in the hype cycle with SDN and NFV? I'm sure we're down the throat of disillusionment, hopefully. And we're now maybe trying to get productive with SDN and NFV. But let's take a look, right? So SDN took us a long while to get here, from 2011. We started with BO, which I call before OpenFlow, right? Not that we didn't have innovation in SDN or NFV, but certainly OpenFlow was a catalyst in the industry. And so from there was a whole flurry. I'm not going to go through in great detail every single thing here. It'll take much longer than the 8 or 10 minutes that we have here this morning. But fundamentally, we went through controllers. Remember the controllers, the whole, couple of hundred controllers out in the marketplace, and then the rise of V-switches. And then we looked at WAN, the real original SD-WAN, software-defined wide area networking, with the B4 networks from Google. Now, obviously, SD-WAN now means something quite different. And then we went from there to consolidation of controllers. I'm sure a lot of us remember Open Daylight, right? And ONOS, and then NSX, right? And then P4, because P4 was better than OpenFlow. But at least we learned what OpenFlow could and couldn't do, and then came along P4. And then we went from there to intent-based, and then the very hot SD-WAN. And so where are we again, right, with SDN? Some people call the next generation of SDN network automation, but you say, wait a minute, we had network automation way back before SDN. Well, what's always new again, right? And we discovered there were certain challenges, which I'll talk about in a second, with SDN, at least the first generation of SDN, that led us back to network automation. And on the NFV side, it was just as long a journey, right? Again, right, it's internet years, so it's 56 years since we had SDN and NFV. And so half a century later, internet time, where are we? We started with a wonderful reference architecture, NFVI, Vim, VNFM, right, NFVO. The fact that all of you actually probably understand what I mean when I say those things is, I don't know if it's a good thing or bad thing, but fundamentally it is a thing, right? And we got there, we had this ETSI architecture, and then we drove towards that. Various hot use cases, VCPE, VEPC, right? VIMS. IMS was really mostly virtualized. It was already software at that point. But if we had a virtual IMS instance running, we said, hey, we have NFV, right? I mean, remember doing that? A lot of people did that, right? And then we did OpenStack. Remember how hot OpenStack was? It's not so hot now, but it's still important, right? DPTK. And then we went through the whole series of VNF onboarding, trying to get all the different vendors, VNFs, to work in your environment. And then we realized that orchestration was really important. We started playing orchestration games. Multi-domain, multi-service, multi-everything orchestration, right? And along came Lean NFV and said, wait, that's all too complicated. Let's keep it simple. And now where are we? We're now looking at containers. Maybe that's the future. Because we couldn't get VMs and VNFs right, maybe containers will solve the problem. Maybe, maybe not. Right? And so where are we right now is looking at 5G, SD-WAN and the edge, at least in NFV, and trying to understand how to get a new core for 5G, and maybe by using the word 5G now we can maybe actually get real NFV. Maybe by using SDN we can get real NFV. Because if we look back, right, we haven't always succeeded, we've made progress, but it's been difficult progress. And I think the reality was maybe, maybe I was naive, having been there in the early days, trying to drive that from the SDX Central side, trying to, get momentum going, right? Say, hey, this is hard, this is really cool, this is wonderful. But we had challenges. There was inconsistency across different vendor implementations. The early OpenFlow implementations on switches had a lot of weird challenges, sometimes obvious, sometimes not. And we tried to take on a lot. We tried to boil the ocean. And so we were not prepared for the complexity, really, that came along. And fundamentally, I think culturally, it was very difficult, especially within the carriers, to get this in. And many companies recognize that. Many carriers recognize that and try to drive initiatives for education within their own employees to try to change that. But it was difficult because fundamentally, from a lot of the vendors, the incumbents, there was no urgency to get to SDN or NFV, right? It didn't always make sense. And as an industry, we certainly, SDN and NFV washed everything, right? Remember, everything was SDN, everything was NFV, just like everything is SD-WAN now, right? But I think it's too early to declare that SDN and NFV are dead, because fundamentally, I think the ideas live on in the initiatives that we have today, whether you call it SD-WAN or 5G or Edge. The principles are there. The progress we've made in the last 7 to 8 years are there and will be helpful. I think we all wish it would have gone a little faster, but fundamentally, maybe that was not to be. But I think we've learned, and hopefully we'll learn better this time. But there are some bright sparks within that whole journey. One of them was an unexpected one called SD-WAN. Who knows, it would have been, I had no idea it was going to be that popular. In fact, I was fighting the term originally over at SDX Central, and people were like, SD-WAN, SD-WAN. I said, no. SD-WAN is software-defined WAN. That's the wide area network portion of software-defined networking. No. This whole thing is SD-WAN. I'm like, what is SD-WAN? Well, it turns out that SD-WAN is basically just a next enterprise edge, right? That's basically what it is. Taking all the edge connectivity needs and concerns within enterprise and then bundling it under SD-WAN. Was it really software-defined? Well, it's really anything is software-defined. But fundamentally, it is the hardest thing since SDN and NFV. You just take a look, do a simple search. There's 60, 70, 80, 90 companies in SD-WAN. Everyone's an SD-WAN vendor now. And the carrier and the managed side of SD-WAN is growing. A lot of enterprises are saying, hey, look, this edge thing is too complex. I'm going to outsource it. SD-WAN. And we're now seeing second waves of deployments at CSPs. In fact, SD-WAN's gone through 2 waves, right? Can you remember that first wave, second wave of SDN? I'm like, what wave, right? But fundamentally, it's an interesting proposition. It's a difficult proposition, right? The carriers are now looking at trying to do UCPE deployments, universal CPEs, with multi-vendors, multi-domains, looking at the SD-WAN fabric essentially as the universal fabric in the future that will tie in the enterprise, the 5G, and the edge, and everything. Right? Again, maybe too much hype. We've got to be careful. But it is a boon for SDN, a boon for NFV, because what I'm seeing at a lot of carriers now is that SD-WAN essentially is the impetus for putting in place the NFV infrastructure we're looking for in the first place. It's interesting, right? So what do we see looking ahead for SDN? We see network automation. Is it true programmability of the network? Maybe, maybe not, depends on the definition. But fundamentally, we're looking to reduce OpEx, make things simpler. A lot of it is around automation. Are people actually programming the control plane or programming the data plane? Not quite, right? So the whole programmability aspect that we expected with the first original SDN movement isn't quite there. Turns out it's a lot harder than we think. Not everyone's qualified to program, the control plane and data plane. It's a little difficult. But where we are today, automation, a lot of it has intent and AI base with that automation to create a closed-loop system, right? And then where we are with SDN is this virtualized fabric. We will see, I think, a collision between the SD-WAN guys and some of the cloud guys in terms of cloud fabrics, right? The transit networks and AWS, connecting the different VPCs, and I think what we'll see is now I'm going to see which is my fabric. Is my SD-WAN fabric? Is it my cloud fabric? What happens with my data center fabric? And we're going to see some interesting things happen around that space, and the vendors will want to play Cisco ACI, VMware NSX, name your favorite flavor, Contrail, Newwatch, and so on and so forth, right? But across all these is a desire to connect everything in a secure manner. Across all this is a way to make sure your applications are connected. And so the hardest thing out there, service mesh on the application side and the network side will mix. And there are new concepts like network service mesh, which depending on your point of view is an oxymoron, or maybe it's the most brilliant thing in the SDN, remains to be seen. But fundamentally, we'll see a lot of network automation under the moniker of so-called SDN or next-gen SDN. And on the NFV side, I think as I said, SD-WAN could be a gateway to full NFV. 5G and Edge are the additional drivers. I think if you ask most CSPs out there, fundamentally they're saying, yeah, we're doing SD-WAN now, but you know what? The CPE there could be our Edge strategy. Really, right? That's what we're all saying. Maybe, maybe not, right? And by the way, we have Kubernetes, right? By the way, we have containers, right? But the VNFs aren't quite there yet. These CNF things, they're rare breed, hard to find, hard to spot in the wild, actually, harder to spot in the wild. So got to be careful. CNS meaning cloud-native network functions, right? And the performance issues will still have to be resolved, right? We'll still have to figure out what we do. We figured out kind of in the VM world, right? DPTK, SRIOV, the original PCI pass-through, impossible to manage, right? What are we going to do in the container world? What do you do now? You have one kernel, one set of drivers, right? What do you do in terms of isolation? Problems that are being solved, but not solved yet. And for a lot of vendors, taking that VNF and putting it in the container doesn't mean it's a CNF, right? So we know better. We should know better, right? Orchestration licensing are still sore points, right? Do you have a license pool? Do you meter by capacity? Do you meter by sockets, right? It's pain. Multiple vendors, multiple licensing schemes, simple things like that, because at the end of the day, you still have to monetize it, right? Don't forget about monetization. Hopefully we haven't forgotten about monetization, right? That's still important. Got to get the EBITDA up, right? And so what do we see? We'll see that the edge is a continuum, eventually, for NFV. There is no edge will beat the cloud or cloud will beat the edge, right? The reality is that the edge should be really an extension of the cloud. And we have to figure out what the platforms are. We have to figure out, more importantly, how we orchestrate all that, and fundamentally, how do we monetize that? And I think the cloud providers have a lot of lessons for us to learn from. And so I think it's important to look to them to see what they've done and how to adapt it appropriately to the carrier world. And so with that, I'd like to wrap. And I don't know if we have time for questions. I'm certainly open to taking them. But before you do that, I would suggest that maybe you listen to the rest of the presentations in the next 3 days. And you can always contact us. Contact information is up there. But I'm looking forward to 3 days of excellent content from a lot of people with a lot of expertise. And at this point, I'll thank you for your time. And let's look forward to 3 days of presentation.